You are a software engineer. We work together at Meetup. Unlike most of the people that I've talked to, you actually went to school for photography. And so I think you have a unique insight into what that looks like in a sort of a more formal educational environment. And I'd love to dig in a little bit around that.
I studied photography at NYU Tisch School of the Arts. I transferred in after my first year at NYU. I was like in over my head for the majority of my college education, but I figured out how to pull it together towards the end. It was really wonderful to be around people who had very specific ideas on what they wanted to do and like how they wanted to find their voice and express their voice in the world. I think it had a lot to do with like who I identified with, because they were just like fun people to be around, and my professors were super sorry. This is my son, Neil. This is
Neil. You're supposed to be in bed, Neil.
He can't hear you because he doesn't have the headset on. All right. Good night, Neil. Expressing myself visually is something that at some level comes natural to me. I definitely think in pictures. Looking back, like why'd they let me in? Like frankly, I'm not too sure. I don't know. They're people just like so much further ahead than me when I was starting. So, okay, you'll get to meet my cat too. There were people there who arrived with like their own visual language and like their subject matter and whatnot. And there are some people who frankly like didn't even change it that much over the time they were there and went on to like have professional careers. Whereas for me, I definitely need to learn photography from like just step one. Like, what does it mean to look through a camera? There are a lot of people who like just have a talent for that, for like seeing the world in lenses and knowing how to capture things. Personally, for me, like that doesn't come naturally, like at all. If I look at like a lot of professional work, particularly people who have a broad range of stuff, I'm just like I don't know how to do that.
Was there any classes or particularly even moments that really stood out to you as being like influential, that you felt like you kind of took a big step forward? Or, you know, how did you feel like as somebody, in your own words, that kind of came in maybe with less developed of a sense of yourself as a photographer? What were those sort of pivotal moments for you?
I mean, I guess for the most part, if you were to measure by like time and like what I put my effort into, like it was just like a lot of failure. People always underestimate like how much failure goes into something that's successful. I definitely had like basically 2 years of having trouble finding my subject matter and my style. I guess I was like getting a sense that like landscape was something that made a little bit more sense to me than like, I don't know, bothering people to take a picture of them to do portraits. Once you are successful at something, you can kind of like figure out how to work forward from there and like, you know, venture out from there rather than always inventing something from the ground up. To me, getting started in photography was, I don't know, it was super difficult.
How did you know in school specifically, like what was working for you and what wasn't working for you?
So that has a lot to do with the critique format, and the critique format we used was pretty common across classes. I mean, there were some variations on it, but for the most part involved pinning work up and not talking about it. And you would just see what people looked at and paid attention to and what they wanted to talk about. And if no one had anything to say about what you did, like, well, you know, like it's not so great. But I think that method of discussion is very specific to art school and also to like thinking visually, because you're not like putting words in front of people telling them, you know, what to think. There was a point where I saw a presentation by a photographer who was going to present his pictures to National Geographic. I think he had a cover story, and he showed us pictures and he talked the whole time. Like every picture needed a justification as to why it was being shown, and that is basically exactly the opposite of, you know, what my experience was.
That format that you're talking about, was that something that was consistent throughout your whole time at NYU? That sort of critique format where this idea of you pin work up on the wall and you sort of shut up and let the class discuss it?
It was universal. Yeah, because I think that it even spanned like the first class I had taken into like the more serious program, and then all the way through to the end. People showed for particular classes, and then people talked about that particular person's work as to make sure people got equal time, and because otherwise, if you're just talking about whatever people want to talk about, you might skip people. Actually, in thinking about this and thinking like what I would like to have you experience, in particular, I had a senior directed projects class, which was really wonderful. Like we came out of that class convinced that we were basically the best class ever. What's really important in this sort of thing is like being invested in the other person is separate from making various points or whatnot, kind of seeing that person grow. It's a very indirect relationship. It's not like you're going to be like, oh, you need to like use this f-stop and this lens. It's more like, what sort of things do you need to think about, or might you consider? And sometimes those ideas like influence people and sometimes they don't. Although I think it's particularly true with photography that it's good to think about things. And then when you're in the act of making pictures and even through the editing process, like don't think about those things. If something strikes you, don't hold back. Yeah. And so like when I think about what your project is, I think about how can, a phone or a computer like simulate that experience. Yeah, this also gets into like what is your goal of improving your photography? For me, it's making artwork and finding some sort of like individual expression take on the world. That requires like slow thought, which is like the opposite of what our devices have been engineered to do. You had mentioned that like previously I told you that like to become a better photographer, shoot more. And like in hearing that like said back to me, I actually winced a little bit thinking like, well, it needs to involve thinking about what you're doing. But then like I realized that like I think it's more recent that people are likely to take pictures without thinking about them. Yeah. So you take the picture, you look at it, you decide whether it's going to like go on Instagram or not, and you might check to see how many likes or comments or whatever, and then you move on. Yeah. Whereas like one thing that we were really encouraged to do, find a place in your house or your apartment or wherever where you can like pin up pictures, and the idea is that like live with them for a bit. So if you're looking directly at something, you might like be working to convince yourself why you like it, and there might be like wonderful things about it, but it might not be there yet. And I think those sort of things tend to sort themselves out long term if you live with something and you're not, I don't know, you're thinking about it more on the periphery. I definitely see like one of the challenges of what you're doing is like, is this a thing you could facilitate? To me, that's like a huge ask. It would be like so worthwhile. So.
What is the actual tone of the conversation in the room when you are discussing someone's work?
I mean, frankly, it can be like anything, which is like what makes it so much fun. So I would say that like there's a range of things that from like, there's no reason to like derail a good conversation with like, forcing everyone to stay on topic about like a particular photograph. But then again, I also think that that's something that like photography like lends itself to, like you took this picture, like, like what was going on at the time. Like I can remember someone who did a series of pictures of like blood in a sink. They were big, they were red, and there was a series, which is also, I don't know, a thing you can do with artwork, which is pretty much guaranteed not to fail. And so like, she like talked a little bit about how she was like having these nosebleeds on a regular basis. I can remember one time like someone saying like, oh, I'd like to shadow that print's making against the wall. And, and that like has like nothing to do with anything and never will be like replicated. It was imperfectly pinned to the wall. So like it created this like, whatever. Beautiful. I remember the shadow, yeah. But then like things that would be like more on topic would be like, have you tried using this piece of equipment, or are you familiar with this artist, or maybe working through like what your subject matter is. I think working through the subject matter is much more a thing, just because that can, to me, that's like so much of photography is just like, what are you going to take a picture of? Should you go to Coney Island? You know? So,
love Coney Island. How important is just technical feedback, let's call it. I mean, does that ever come up in these kind of things, like, you screwed up the exposure, or like the colors are wrong here?
That's definitely something that gets talked about. I think that was something that was like a little bit more important when I was in school, mostly because one could have hopes of making a career with those skills, whereas nowadays the opportunity for that is much smaller. Let's see. I really think that a lot of that has more to do with people feeling good enough. Am I, executing this well is just like a proxy for feelings of self-worth. So for me, it's like so much more about what you're trying to say and having a voice and what your perspective is. I would much rather have like a slightly out of focus picture that has something to say than like a cliche that's like been perfectly executed.
So you shot a lot of landscape stuff, right? Do you find it easier or harder to critique or feel like you have good, thoughtful, new ideas possibly on other artists that are working in the same genre, or the reverse?
I think that like varies a lot for everyone. Do you know the photographer Lee Friedlander?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So apparently there were a couple times where like he subbed at NYU. I think that this was well before my time, and like the general consensus, like including from the class, which for me this is like ridiculous to think, was like they everyone thought he sucked. and so like, you've got someone who like, I mean, for me, he's like my all-time favorite. Mm-hmm. Basically a god of a photographer, and like he was like so focused on his own work that like it was hard for him to talk about other people's stuff, and I do think that can be a problem. I do think that like work that's too much like mine, I'll sometimes want to like turn it into mine. So like I will know the space real well, but like you can have that friction.
But you feel comfortable commenting on, let's say, street photography in a critical way, even though it's not what you primarily shoot? I do. But I think that like no matter what it is, like there's going to be some variation as to like how connected you feel to the work. Like that's like just so personal. Like one thing I think about it personally for me, like the way I relate to photography, and I think I actually relate this way to programming and a lot of things in life, is like I am like trying to find like the best whatever. Like I have a very specific like thing that I want or that I'll find pleasurable, and I don't know. It's just like, if it's not quite there, sometimes like I just don't even like pay attention. How important do you think it is to be familiar with someone's previous work when you are trying to give them feedback?
That may or may not matter. However, I do think it's important to know the person. If you're not taking into account the whole person when you're providing feedback, you are probably not doing as good of a job as you could. I mean, I definitely think that like if you provide good feedback without knowing that, and it hits its mark, it's kind of like, making a shot from half court or something. Because you're really investing in the person more than the work, I don't really think you can invest in a person without knowing them real well. Honestly, like one of my reactions to like what you're trying to do is like, I think the best examples I've seen of what you're trying to do are in like the old like online forums that have like essentially been forgotten by time.
I've looked at some of those.
Yeah, I mean, like honestly, like the other day, I was like, lately I like to look at car stuff just to like unwind, and there was someone who was like putting one engine in, like from one car into like this other car, and I was just like, what are these guys getting into? And like, by the end of it, like everyone like knows who they are and what their limitations and strengths are, and like I think that there might be something about that older format where I don't know, like why. I mean, it probably helps that there's not like buttons. Like the lack of that is probably helpful. If you're going to be showing people pictures, particularly in a digital manner, like how do you get them to slow down and to take them in? And I think that might be an argument for having audio along with the pictures. I would think that I'd want it to be like the photographer talking about like what they're doing, but like that way, if everybody takes that in, at least they've spent like so many minutes like looking at the work and hearing about the person.
So I've thought a lot about that piece of time spent as well, and how do you sort of reward thoughtfulness, because it's so antithetical to the way that most of these, our current batch of social media tools work. And I think that the sweet spot, at least the way I'm thinking about this right now, is like something that is kind of in the middle there, where you still aren't asking people for 30 minutes of their time to like sit down and meditate on something, but at the same time, like, you're getting more than you would get just by posting a picture to Instagram and getting 50 likes on it or 100 likes or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. You know what I think you actually might like consider in your design is headspace, which I mean, on him might seem ridiculous, but like I think that there's like a similar like relationship with time and the device. And actually, come to think, like those are like how long are they? I don't even know. It's been a while since I've opened that thing.
Well, you seem very zen and meditative, so I'm surprised that you.
Yeah. Maybe the best way to respond to like something you take in like that is just by talking, like instead of like having someone like punch it out on their computer. And actually, that's one of the benefits of hearing people's voices is that like it's not, or it's like it's more personal, compared to like some text on the screen. You get some, I don't know, sense of emotional tone and whatnot. Because like the first photography class I took, and I think that this is true with any sort of like beginning art class, like it's basically a bunch of people just like dicking around with like pen and paper or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very important. Is that something good to focus on? Like maybe there is room for like a more casual relationship with the art and more casual feedback, yet still being engaged and learning. Yeah, which would be different than like, I've got this big project and how do I like keep pushing it forward?
Right, exactly. And you're hitting on another big theme that I've been thinking about is, in an art school format, it's like you work on a project, you have the big critique day, you put the stuff up on the wall, it's almost sort of an event. Here's my best shot at this, and like, let's talk about it. And that's certainly valuable. Even a photo that you may say, well, I know this isn't my best work. I'm not even claiming that, but there's still something to be learned potentially from submitting it, seeing what others think of it, getting some sort of response.
Yeah, I think like one question that's worthwhile to ask, and that I think becomes clear when you get to know people, which is like, what do you want from this? Like, what are you trying to improve or work on or refine?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're talking to a wider audience, I feel like, in college, it's going to have a particular direction. Let's see. But outside of that, it's, why are you trying to get better at photography?
Why do you make photographs?
For quite a while, it was to like keep myself sane. That's something that has like changed over the years, but it's still a very important part of who I am. I like really got myself in over my head by going to college in New York. One of the coping mechanisms I eventually figured out for that was going on long walks. And so I would bring my camera along for that. Photography is generally like, how am I relating to the world? Where am I going to go? Where am I going to stand? What am I going to experience? There was a long time where I would do this and like I really wouldn't come up with anything I was too happy with, but like I'd always feel good in the end because like I went for a long walk and like I burnt off a bunch of energy. I've always just had a lot of physical energy like that, and I go crazy if I don't have an outlet for it. I've tried to like bring the camera out for like a couple hours at a time, and like it's hard for me. It needs to be like a full day. So at any rate, like when it really works, like I come away super happy because I've had some sort of like crazy collaboration with the world that like, seems ridiculously improbable.